we've come out of a 2-year congressional cycle where House Republicans had the majority, unlike the 2 years prior. And unlike 2 years ago, when Republicans were running in House seats and trying to be a little vague about, their plans. They were running away from a plan written up by Florida Senator Rick Scott and saying, "Oh, we're not really like that." This year, there's enough people there on the far right that they're embracing the things that they're running on, including through a group called the Republican Study Committee in the House, which has put together a blueprint for how they would handle the budget in 2025. And you're going to be hearing a lot about it in things like the way that it's going to, if passed, would raise the retirement age for Social Security. It would threaten in vitro fertilization. It would do a whole host of things that Republicans have talked about doing for a long time, all in one fell swoop. Well, the Republican Study Committee does include every current House Republican, which is Scott Fitzgerald, Glenn Grothman, Brian Stile, and Tom Tiffany. And many or all of them have a good chunk of rural Wisconsin in their district. And there would be impacts on rural Wisconsin if this budget blueprint were to be adopted. We certainly saw that from the Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, recently. And so I wanted to bring in our friend Hans Breitenmoser to talk a bit about it. And he went and brought a friend as well. Mike Strands is the Vice President for Advocacy for the National Farmers Union, and he joins us from Washington, D.C. Hans, good morning to you. Thanks for being here.
Good morning, Pat, and good morning, Mike.
What is happening up there in the Merrill area this week? I know we can no longer complain about drought-like conditions.
No, we got some rain, but it was needed. That slowed us down a little bit, so we had to stop putting seed in the ground and stop hauling manure. But today we're going to try and get some manure hauled again, and hopefully in a few days here we'll be back out there turning some dirt and trying to get some seed in the ground again.
All right. Well, you have been, of course, active in the Wisconsin Farmers Union for quite some time here. So when I told you I kind of wanted to talk about this national Republican blueprint, and you were able to get a hold of Mike and have him join us from D.C., I have a feeling that they're well aware of what congressional Republicans are proposing, Hans. And you've been out to D.C., so you have a pretty good sense of what kind of an advocacy arm you have out there.
Yeah, yep. So we brought in the big guns today and went straight to the top.
All right.
And enlighten us a little bit on some of the things that National Farmers Union has for priorities and so forth. And yeah, sometimes they don't line up with our policymakers. So.
No, which is something we'll get into over the next few minutes. Mike, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Glad to be here. Thanks for the invite, Hans, and good to be on the show today, Pat.
Yeah, well, again, you're plenty familiar with what is being talked about by members of the Republican Study Committee, and many of them are on the House Agriculture Committee. So, what is National Farmers Union's top line overview of this potential budget blueprint if it were to be, adopted in full as is? What would it mean?
Yeah, so the Republican Study Committee report that came out comes at an important time, given that we're right up against the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill expired back in September of 2023, was extended for another year. So right now, we're about a month away, less than a month probably, from when the House Agriculture Committee is going to hold a markup on the next version of the Farm Bill. So these proposals out there from the Republican Study Committee fed into and are feeding into the process they're following to put forward a draft for this next Farm Bill. So some of the cuts and changes to programs in there would be a big impact if immediately enacted. And even if not immediately fully enacted, they would also work into the mix for what is going to be part of that Farm Bill. And I think it would have some big impacts for farmers and just people in general across Wisconsin.
What are some of the things that we might see specifically in terms of whether it's subsidies that keep farms alive with low market prices, but also the what they are able to receive by putting unused land into conservation programs? What are some of the exact impacts that some of rural Wisconsin could see in this package?
Yeah, so a lot of the proposals in the study committee's blueprint left us thinking like, okay, so where's the rest of it? There's a cut made, but nothing to replace it. No plan beyond that, just eliminating some of these initiatives. For instance, like you mentioned, making sure there's land in conservation, the Conservation Reserve Program, the proposal would just end new signups. And CRP has been a big part of the conservation plan going on across the country for decades now. And it's had some successes along the way. And to just eliminate it or leave it as it is, letting it kind of wither away, isn't really a plan. That's just cutting something. And then probably even more striking is the proposal to eliminate the dairy programs in the Farm Bill. And granted, Farmers Union would be the first to say we need some big changes to the dairy programs, but to just eliminate them without putting into effect some sort of revitalization plan like Wisconsin Farmers Union, the National Farmers Union have talked about, seems irresponsible. So it would be a striking change.
Well, that's just it, is that it's not that you're being simply reactive to a proposal like this, but that National Farmers Union and Wisconsin Farmers Union, you've put ideas on the table. You've gone, Hans, you've been to DC, you've talked to individual members of Congress. So again, you've got actual things they could work on if they wanted to have a conversation with you about specific changes that would be positive for Wisconsin farmers, right, Mike?
Yeah, the Hans and company and the rest of Wisconsin Farmers Union and Farmers Union members around the country have been to DC to advocate specifically on the dairy proposals, but also other Farm Bill proposals that would be harmed by the proposals in the study committee. And if that just went into law as it is, we'd feel it, and it wouldn't take long.
Hans, what are your thoughts on, again, just scrapping some of these policies around dairy and around conservation, as opposed to working to fine tune these things? What's your take on this whole package?
Well, I think we have to zoom out a little bit and think about what most farmers want. And I think Mike alluded to it earlier, right? Most farmers are not looking for handouts. We would prefer to have a fair share of the market, fair share of the pie, if you will, and stable prices. And so, instead of, spending so much mental energy figuring out how to cut CRP and so forth, maybe some of these policymakers should be a little more concerned about antitrust legislation that gets us some of the prices that we have to begin with. That's the greater issue here. I think these safety nets are well-intentioned and well-received, but let's figure out how to get us to a point where family farmers can make a living and there's some sort of parity so that some of these subsidies wouldn't be necessary to begin with.
Well, and it appears that these cuts are motivated by one main factor, and Secretary Vilsack has pointed it out as well. And that's the one thing that Republican politicians say they're trying to do for farmers, is they talk about the estate tax. And we're going to get rid of that estate tax because that is so onerous to farmers. But Vilsack noted that in 2020, 31,000 farmers passed away. 189 of that 31,000 had estates that had to file estate taxes, and only 50 farms out of those 31,000 paid the estate tax. The total tax paid was $130 million compared to farm wealth transfer of $56 billion. In other words, Mike, use pig in a poke or whatever saying you want, but this is, this is not about farmers. This is about wealthy donors.
Mm-hmm. Those estate tax issues come up time and again whenever there's a tax package about to move. And while there are sometimes we see proposals that would start to impact family farmers more and more, what's really been happening hasn't gotten even close to that yet. So we need to keep a close eye on that and make sure that if there are tax changes to the estate tax, step up in basis, a lot of different proposals out there, that they're not going to hit family farmers and ranchers. But sometimes that gets pulled out of scale a little bit.
Sure.
Sometimes I think we're farming red herrings.
I can understand that. And again, like you said about dairy and conservation programs, when it comes to, amending the tax code and making sure that it's not, harmful to most family farmers, there are ideas and proposals out there. Just a giveaway to billionaires is not necessarily one of them. Mike, tell me more about some of what National Farmers Union has been advocating for, either in this current session or, having seen how gridlocked it is, you're already looking ahead to what you're going to advocate for in the next session of Congress.
Well, Hans hit on it already, and that's making sure we're addressing the issue of monopolies in agriculture. If you want to make a difference without spending a lot of federal dollars to improve the farm economy for individual family farmers and ranchers, go after antitrust. Push for that. We've seen some big steps by the Biden administration over the last couple of years. Better enforcement of the Packers and Stockyards Act, that's helped a lot and will continue to help. We've seen the Federal Trade Commission go after and look into acquisitions and mergers and farm inputs, whether that's on machinery, on right to repair, or on fertilizer businesses. Just last week, the chair of the Federal Trade Commission was in Iowa speaking with farmers union leaders about the Koch industry proposed purchase of Iowa fertilizer. So go after those sorts of things. Build a more competitive market. It doesn't cost all that much compared to a lot of the other programs out there, and it makes a huge difference for family farmers.
And those farmers, like the rest of us, they're looking to retire someday. They're looking at things like prescription drug costs. A statement from the White House on the Republican Study Committee budget says that this will lead to Medicare cuts, Social Security raising the retirement age. It will endanger the Affordable Care Act. It will lead to a national abortion ban. It will raise housing costs. It will raise prescription drug costs for families. So we get to essentially the fork in the road here. We can share this information all day long, but right now across much of rural America, it is an electorate that tends to vote Republican. Wasn't always that way. You look at northern Wisconsin. They sent David Obey to Washington for 40 years, and a whole bunch of the legislators used to have relatively safe districts in the rural areas. When you're looking at a plan like this and the potential damage not just to farming as an occupation, but things like prescription drug costs and other things like that, where do you go, Mike, with that to inform rural voters that they might want to, think hard about who they want to vote for compared to previous elections? How do you get that message to them?
I think, especially when it comes into the agriculture world and the rural issues you brought up too on healthcare and Medicaid and programs that are so important to rural quality of life, there's a record to look at here. And we see some of the proposals that are in this Republican Study Committee budget. And then we also look at some of the things that have been done in the last 3 years with the Biden administration. So taking a good hard look at just on these agriculture proposals, we hear a lot about how one party might favor farmers more than the others. Well, you look at some of these proposals and it's hard to know who people are pointing at there. So I think that it's important to get this message out there. Secretary Vilsack talked about that over the last couple of weeks here on how harmful some of these proposals would be. And I think that helps enlighten and get the word out more about how onerous some of these changes might be.
And Hans, that takes us to our last point, and that is we talk often about young farmers, young families, trying to encourage them, support them. So when you hear from the Republican sponsors that, well, raising the retirement age, this won't affect anybody in, say, their 50s and 60s. We're talking about the young folks who now they wouldn't have them retire until 72. I mean, again, if you're trying to encourage young rural families, this does not seem like the way to go.
Well, we've got a lot of work to do to try and encourage young rural families to stay in rural areas. And that starts with making sure that we've got quality schools, quality roads, the infrastructure, and it speaks to some of the training and money that goes towards technical college and so forth. So there's a lot of ways that rural America can use some revitalization, but I don't think the estate tax is necessarily the one that we should be most concerned about.
No, it's not the one on the top of young families' minds. Mike Strands, Vice President for Advocacy for the National Farmers Union. This has been a real pleasure, a privilege. Thank you. I hope you'll come back again soon.
Be glad to. Thanks for having me.
All right. Hans, thank you so much. Good luck with planting and everything else out there. We'll talk to you in a couple of weeks.
You bet. Thanks a lot, Pat.
All right. When we come back, Chad Holmes from Bull Falls Radio will tell us about his show coming up next along the Civic Media Radio Network. Back in a bit.